Good morning, Raider Nation. It's Mr. David Swanson here, actually Major Swanson on this day. I'm coming to you from fabulous Fort Moore, Georgia, in Columbus, Georgia, previously known as Fort Benning, Georgia, but recently renamed to reflect the true and faithful service of U.S. military veterans just like yourself, veterans who served the United States. So here I am at Fort Moore. I'm actually at the Global War on Terrorism Memorial Park, which is a part of the National Infantry Museum. And while I regret that I can't be with you on this breakfast morning at Bacon County High School, what a better place to be and talk a little bit about what Veterans Day means to me. So I am, first let me introduce myself and what I do. I'm a National Guardsman. I'm in the Georgia Army National Guard, and a lot of times we like to refer to that as being a citizen soldier. I'm a citizen in Bacon County, and of course, a lot of you know my role is to teach social studies at the high school. I've had your kids or grandkids in class, but I'm also a soldier, a citizen soldier, and I serve my country, state, and community. I serve the governor, the president when called upon. So National Guard is a wonderful opportunity to be exactly that, a citizen soldier, and to do really the best of both worlds, service in the military in uniform and at home. If you would let me today, just tell you a little bit about what Veterans Day means to me. You know, I think a lot about what I do at Bacon County High School. I teach social studies. I teach United States history. I call it the story of us, U.S., the United States, but also the story that has made all of us. And as I tell the story of us to your kids and your grandkids, and some of them still coming on up, and I'll be excited to have them in my classroom someday, I think about the story of U.S. military veterans. And I really recognize, the more I understand U.S. history, the more I recognize the giants who have come in service before me and before you. I think we have to acknowledge we stand on the shoulders of giants. And it makes me think about the original Revolutionary War patriots, the sons and daughters of liberty. They didn't join the United States military, they created it. So I think about the Enlightenment ideals that they founded the country upon, the idea that there's a creator who's endowed us with certain unalienable rights. Among those are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the idea that all men are created equal. And they stood up to a tyrannical government and created a nation, birthed a nation. And of course, none of us would be here today without those first military veterans. This Veterans Day wouldn't be a thing without them. I think about John Adams, our second president. He said that he studies war and politics so that his son may study math, poetry, and philosophy. And that's actually exactly what happened. That first generation of veterans, they didn't want to be war makers for the rest of their lives. They wanted to create a country so that their children and their children's children could live better lives in freedom. And that's exactly what they created. I do think about how the next generation of U.S. military veterans were born of that first generation of patriots. Men and women in the United States in 1812 had to confirm liberty, freedom, and independence, had to fight the British again. So that first generation of veterans birthed a second important generation of veterans who stood up and confirmed our liberty again. Then I think about, as time marches on and the story of us marches on, I think about the War of the Rebellion, commonly known as the Civil War, and a very important generation of veterans who stood up for the United States, served their country. A lot of times we might think about how Washington created the Republic, but then President Lincoln and Grant rescued it, and get a very important generation of veterans from that time period, the 1860s. Actually, following the Civil War, we get a day of remembrance known as Decoration Day, which will become Memorial Day. So we have a day now to honor military veterans who have died, but what about those who have served? The story marches on. I think about a period of time of non-intervention in our country. We decided that we'll just stay at home. Whatever's going on in Europe, that's European affairs. Let's not get drawn into a foreign entanglement that doesn't belong to us. And so I'm thinking about the time period of the rise of the world wars. World War I, we tried to stay out of it for as long as we could until a variety of circumstances drew us into war in Europe. And actually the United States veteran, the doughboy, the American doughboy who went overseas, broke the stalemate of the trench warfare and the warring powers. A lot of times it was seen as good versus evil. World War I is called the Great War, or even the war to end all wars. It didn't, but they really believed they were in a great struggle of good and evil, one last battle for all of time and eternity to create peace, and lasting peace is what we wanted to create. Well, the end of World War I actually gives us Veterans Day. World War I ends with an armistice, and the language of the armistice is this: we will lay down our arms, we will cease firing at the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month of the year 1918. So that's 11 a.m. on November 11th. Oh, do you get it now? November 11th, recognized today as Veterans Day. Originally was known as Armistice Day, especially throughout the Commonwealth countries. The British, UK, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and America also adopts November 11th as Armistice Day. President Woodrow Wilson gives us Armistice Day, and November 11th is recognized as that for many years henceforth. All right, so the story of us is arriving closer to today. Then, of course, I have to think about what is known as the greatest generation, those who went and fought and won World War II, because World War I was in fact not the war to end all wars, but the greatest generation that goes across an ocean and takes on totalitarian governments, the fascist governments of the Kingdom of Italy, Nazi Germany, the Empire of Japan and their expansionist attitude, and through many adversities and foxholes and mud and slog and beach landings, bombings, raidings, victory was had in Europe and in Japan. And that gives us a very important new generation of veterans. It's actually this returning generation of veterans that makes our nation recognize that we don't need to just honor those who passed in service, and also don't want to exclusively honor those from World War I. We want to honor all veterans. So Veterans Day, as you know it today, comes to us from President Eisenhower in the year 1954. He makes the 11th day of the 11th month into now Veterans Day, and it's to honor veterans from the world wars and into the past. And I have to imagine President Eisenhower knew there would also be more. Actually, at that very time, we're embroiled in a conflict in Korea. The Korean War is often called the Forgotten War. It was actually not even a declared war. Now, certainly we can use the word war, and those who went and fought it sure felt like war, and they are veterans. They're certainly veterans. But this kind of sets a new precedent for how our military will be used going forward in undeclared conflicts. So you got a generation of veterans from Korea, the Forgotten War. Then you got Vietnam War, often called the Forever War. And because war wasn't declared, and the way the president and Congress now have the ability to use the military without a declaration of war, gives us these unending conflicts, and of course many traumas that come from veterans returning home. And you just have to be honest, the nation wasn't as grateful as it ought to have been for their service in the 1960s and 1970s. And I'm sure there are some in the room today that remember those years and the hardships of those years. You see, the story of us is a sequence of ups and downs. When I tell the story of us as students in class, I know what's coming. I know the twists and the turns. I know what we're going to struggle with, but I also know the exceptionalism, the American exceptionalism that is weaved throughout the story as well. So while our country did not treat veterans as it ought to have in the 1960s and 1960s, hang on, we're coming to today. The next generation of veterans is going to experience a series of some named conflicts, some short conflicts. I think about Grenada and Panama. I think about Desert Shield and Desert Storm, and a very different national attitude toward veterans who returned from the Gulf War in 1991. And then, of course, that gives us one sad day in September when planes were used as weapons in New York City and Washington, D.C. And of course, I'm referring to September 11th, 2001, when the present younger generation, those in the room today, maybe a little bit younger, have experienced the global war on terrorism. And everyone has a story. It's the day when the day that the towers fell is the day that the world stood still, and everybody remembers where they were. I imagine you're getting goosebumps thinking about that right now. When I tell that portion of the story of us, it's something I remember very vividly, and something that very significantly affected my life, because I and many others at that point confirmed my decision that I wanted to join the U.S. military. Even as a young person, I was in middle school at that time, and I knew that I wanted to give myself back to my country in service because of what the images I saw on the screen and what my country was engaged in. That gives us a new era of military service where President George W. Bush has something called the Bush Doctrine. He says that we're going to take the fight to the enemy. We got hit at home, and we see the tragedy in the American streets. We're not going to let that happen again. We're going to take the fight to the enemy, and we declared war on terror. And I got to tell you, it's hard to fight an abstract concept like terror. The global war on terrorism is very asymmetric, irregular warfare. It's easy to fight a Nazi. He wears a uniform and his army is that way. Point your gun that way, go fight the Nazis. Very hard to fight an abstract concept like terror. You don't know what a terrorist always looks like, how old they are, whether it's a male or a female. And sometimes they blend right back into the environment from which they came and fired a weapon at you. Fighting terror is a very difficult idea, and many of us have experienced the global war on terrorism. We have recently formally concluded the global war on terrorism. American soldiers have left Iraq. American soldiers recently withdrew from Afghanistan. The global war on terrorism also included conflict in the Philippines, North Africa, even South America. And you could say it remains ongoing while major combat operations have concluded. When I think about a veteran, I really think about a scripture from the Bible, out of the book of John chapter 15 and verse 13. In this verse, Jesus says, "Greater love has no one than this, that he would lay down his life for another." And Jesus is speaking of himself, what he's going to accomplish on the cross, laying down his life as a rescue for all of humanity. And while maybe not officially in any government document, we're a government that says in God we trust, but I'm not sure John 15:13 is cited in any military doctrine specifically. But I have to say, I believe that a veteran who puts on this uniform has essentially written a check to the nation, to the United States, cost up to and including my life, essentially living out the values of John 15:13, one who is willing to lay down his life for another. That's what I think about when I think about who is a veteran and what does service cost. As I conclude my thoughts here today, I just want to point out one thing. Those of students who have passed through Mr. Swanson's classroom have heard this before, and community, I just want you to be ready for what to expect. See, when I share about Veterans Day in my classroom, and I've shared with years past, and though I'm not with you here today, I'll share with students present as well. I want to change my headgear here real quick, and I want to put on this black hat. This black hat that says veteran. I don't often wear my Afghanistan veteran hat, but I see many of you in and around town who wear a hat just like this. I don't know why it's black. I don't know why the letters are yellow. It's almost like an unofficial uniform for veterans. We've lived in uniform, and now we still have a piece of a uniform with this black hat. And when I go to Boat Rights Buffet on a Sundays, I see a lot of these in and around the dining room. Well, I tell my students when they see someone who's wearing a black hat and it lists their era of service, I'm sure that we see some in the room right now: Korean veteran, Vietnam veteran, global war on terrorism veteran. Marines, you guys like to wear your red hats that says Marine veteran because oorah. Well, I tell my students when they see a hat like this, go up to that individual, shake their hand, say those important words, "Thank you for your service." But I gotta be honest, sometimes it's just a little too easy to say "thank you for your service" and run away. So what I tell my students is say "thank you for your service," and then ask that person for a life story. Because veterans, let me tell you, we've got a lot of life and leadership stories that deserve to be told. I tell my students who have veterans in their family, if you have a veteran in your family who's willing to share their story, please interview them and write that story down for your personal family history. Because veterans, we've got stories that need to be told. We've got leadership lessons that need to be shared. And I'm telling you, this up and coming younger generation needs to know what our service stories are. So don't be surprised if a Bacon County High School student comes up to you, shakes your hand, says "thank you for your service," and I tell them, buy that man or woman a cup of coffee, sit down and get a life lesson from them as well. So don't be surprised if you're wearing your hat and a high school student comes up to you and asks you for a story. Families, I want to say thank you to you as well. You serve as well. My family and kids have moved. When Uncle Sam says jump, all you say is how high, and the family has moved every time. So spouses and children of veterans, thank you for your service as well. Thank you for supporting your veteran along the way. A veteran is anyone who has ever served in uniform. Frontline soldier, combat operations, in peacetime, in wartime, logisticians, cooks, chaplains, and everyone in between. If you've worn this uniform, this day is for you. And I want to say thank you for your service. It has mattered. Veterans, thank you for sharing your stories with me as I've been in Alma for 4 years now. I'm going to continue shaking your hands, asking you for a story and a leadership lesson, and I would appreciate you continuing to impart those to me personally. Bacon County staff who have served, thank you for your service and for continuing to love on our community and raise our kids and coach our teams as well. Thank you for your service. I want to pass the program now to two young voices of democracy. You know, they're going to read you their essay from the VFW's Voice of Democracy essay contest. But I want to tell you, these two youngsters are the voice of democracy. Ray Tucker, Julia Wicker, come on up. I've had both of these individuals in class for 2 consecutive years. They are beautiful minds. They have wonderful thoughts, and I'm sure that their words are going to be enlightening to you here today. Let me say this. I've seen the future. Did you know that? I've seen the future, and the future is bright. They are the future, and the future is bright. Ray and Julia, thank you for your efforts in writing this essay, and come on up and we will hear some words from you at this time. Raider Nation, from beautiful Fort Moore, Mr. Major David Swanson is signing off.